Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the cardiac cycle and cardiac electrophysiology. So we've now talked about the cardiac cycle, which is this cycle that takes about 0.8 seconds for each cycle. And it's this cycle of the heart beating and relaxing. And we've seen that initially the atria contract and then the ventricles contract. And this occurs every 0.8 seconds, and it continues on and on and on. So, what I now want to talk about, and what we will indeed be focusing on for the rest of this video, is how is this actually brought about? What actually causes this to happen? So we talked about the fact that the heart is made up of loads of cardiomyocytes, and that each of these cardiomyocytes is going to contract, well, can contract, and that the contraction of loads of the cardiomyocytes in the wall of these chambers of the heart is what is actually going to cause the chamber to contract. Okay, so we've also talked about the fact that electrical signals arriving at cells is what then triggers the cardiomyocyte to contract. So, initially what I'm going to do is not actually go through the details of what I mean by an electrical signal. So I hope you understand the concept of a signal. It's a signal that's the form of which is electrical. We will talk in a lot of detail later on about the exact nature of this electrical signal, but at the moment just understand that it's a message, basically, that can be sent from one cardiomyocyte to the next, and when this message arrives at a cardiomyocyte, it causes the cardiomyocyte to contract. That initially is a good enough understanding for what we're going to discuss, because all I want to see is how does the signal actually propagate through the heart, what's the path that it follows, and how that then leads to the correct portions of the heart contracting at the correct times. Okay, so the heart then, it contracts rhythmically in this way with a period of 0.8 seconds or thereabouts. What actually triggers the initial electrical signal? Well, the first concept that you have to be very clear on is that it's not triggered by nerves. Okay, nerves do not play a role in making sure that the heart continues this rhythmic cycle of electrical activity. Okay, if you disconnect all of the nerves that go to the heart, it will still undergo the cardiac cycle rhythmically. So all of this electrical activity, it's generated internally in the heart. It does not require nerves at all. Okay, so where is it actually generated? Well, there is a portion of the heart called the Sinoatrial Node, and I think that's where we need to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw another picture of the heart, and I'm now going to go back to drawing the heart in the way I said I would right at the beginning. So with this simple picture here, which remember is this cross-section, which is going to show all four of the chambers. So here is the left atrium, here of course is the right atrium, here is the left ventricle, and here is the right ventricle here. Okay, and what's nice also about this is that it shows us all of the walls of the chambers of the heart. Okay, so we need to start off with a specialized portion of cardiomyocytes, and this is an important concept actually straight away. So there are different types of cardiomyocytes in the heart. The main type of cardiomyocyte is just the contraction form of cardiomyocyte, the form of cardiomyocytes which can contract and shorten their length and therefore can play a role in the actual contraction of the entire wall of the heart. However, there are other cardiomyocytes that are not very good at contraction and are specialized just to conduct signals, okay, through the heart. And there are still further cardiomyocytes that are actually specialized to generate the signals. So the Sinoatrial Node is a specialized cluster of cardiomyocytes that can actually generate signals, generate electrical signals. And this special cluster of cardiomyocytes is in the wall of the right atrium, up near the superior vena cava. Okay, so it's up on this picture that's more anatomically true. It's up here near the superior vena cava. Okay, now the first thing to say is that if you were given a heart to look at anatomically, you would not be able to find the Sinoatrial Node. Okay, it doesn't look any different from the rest of the heart, but it has an incredible physiological function. Electrically, it's very different from its surrounding atrial cardiomyocytes. Okay, so this is a cluster of cardiomyocytes. It's not just one cardiomyocyte, it's a whole bunch of cardiomyocytes that have very special properties, but which are just a little patch of the right atrium here. Okay, and it's for short abbreviated down to the SAN here. So this stands for the Sinoatrial, that's the SA, and then the N is for node. And often people will just call it the SA node. Okay, so when speaking, people will often just say the SA node. When writing, people will often abbreviate it right down to SAN here. Okay, so this is a cluster of special atrial cardiomyocytes up in the wall of the right atrium near the superior vena cava. Okay, now what's special about these cardiomyocytes is that they generate electrical signals every 0.8 seconds. So every 0.8 seconds, I'll write that special number down again. So remember, that's the cycle duration, the time for between consecutive cycles. Okay, so every 0.8 seconds, the cardiomyocytes in the sinoatrial node are going to generate electrical signals, and they'll all generate them at the same time. So you won't have them, all of the different cells here, generating them out of phase. They'll all generate them together. Okay, what's now going to happen is they're going to pass the electrical signal onto the neighbouring atrial cardiomyocytes that are more normal. They're the contraction ones. Okay, so it'll spread it to the ones that are surrounding it, and then they'll spread it even further. They'll spread it to the ones surrounding them. So that's an important point. Even the contraction cardiomyocytes, they are capable of conducting an electrical signal. They're capable of conducting the electrical signal to their neighbours. So the electrical signal spreads out along the cardiomyocytes in the wall of the right atrium and along the cardiomyocytes in the wall of the left atrium. Okay, so the electrical signal spreads out from the sinoatrial node, and of course when the electrical signal arrives at the cardiomyocytes in the atria, it will cause them to contract. So what's going to happen is this will spread very, very rapidly. Okay, so both atria will contract. Now, some people just think that there aren't any special conduction networks in the atria, that conduction of the electrical signal through the atria to the next portion down here, okay, is just done, and I'll tell you about that next portion in a moment, is just done through the normal contraction cardiomyocytes. However, it's growing in belief that there is actually an atrial conduction system. So let me just tell you about this. So the atrial conduction system. Now, we believe that there are special tracks of cardiomyocytes that are very, very good at conducting the electrical signal faster than the other cardiomyocytes that are more specialized for contraction. And these are going to conduct it to something called the AV node. Okay, so we're talking now about the atrial conduction system. Okay, so a really important concept that I need to get out of the way now is that the electrical signal cannot propagate from the atrial cardiomyocytes, so from the cardiomyocytes in the wall of the atria, to the ventricular cardiomyocytes. There is an electrical insulation, which I'll just draw bluntly like so, separating the cardiomyocytes of the atria from the cardiomyocytes of the ventricles. Okay, so even though the electrical signal from the sinoatrial node can spread along the atrial cardiomyocytes, it gets to this electrical insulation here, okay, between the atria and the ventricles, okay, which some people call the atrioventricular septum here, this fibrous tissue that is insulating the atrial cardiomyocytes and the ventricular cardiomyocytes, separating them off so that the atrial cardiomyocytes cannot send electrical signals to the ventricular cardiomyocytes, and neither can the ventricular cardiomyocytes send electrical signals to the atrial cardiomyocytes. So this is called the atrioventricular septum here. So this is electrical insulation, okay, just in the form of fibrous connective tissue. Okay, so even though it can spread down the atria, it cannot get to the ventricles. So there is going to be a special hole in this, a special conduction through this called the AV node, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, in fact we'll talk about it now. So there is a special place where the electrical signal can actually cross from the atrial cardiomyocytes to the ventricular cardiomyocytes, and this is known as the atrioventricular node, and it's around here, near where the beginning of the interventricular septum is here. So this node, which is the one sort of hole in the atrioventricular septum where the electrical signal can pass from the atria to the ventricles, this is known as the atrioventricular node. Okay, also just called the AVN on paper for short, or spoken short, people will call it the AV node, the atrioventricular node. Okay, so in order for the electrical signal then from the atria to pass to the ventricles, it has to go through the atrioventricular node. Now this is the bit where I'm going to come back to talking about the atrial conduction system. Okay, it is now genuinely believed, although there are still disbelievers, that there are conduction pathways which take the electrical signal from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node, and which are specialized to deliver it faster than it will get there just by conduction through the normal cardiomyocytes. And it's believed that there are actually three of these: one that's anterior, one that's in the middle, and one that's sort of posterior. So this would be along the posterior wall here. Okay, whoops, and this one doesn't even connect up, it would have to go round like that. Okay, so these special conduction pathways, and all they are these strings of special cardiomyocytes that are very, very good at conducting the electrical signal faster than the normal cardiomyocytes that are specialized for contraction. Okay, these are known as the three internodal pathways of the atrial conduction system. So these are called the internodal pathways. Another conduction pathway that we believe is in the atrium is a conduction pathway that takes the signal from the sinoatrial node and then releases it into the left atrium. Okay, because as you can see, the sinoatrial node is on the right side of the heart, it's on the right atrial side. Okay, you'd like the right atrium and the left atrium to contract as synchronously as possible. Okay, so you need to get the signal onto the left atrial side as quickly as possible. So having a quick conduction route which can pass the electrical signal from the sinoatrial node to the left atrium is going to be desirable. Okay, so this tract, this is called the interatrial tract, or it's even got a special name, it's named after someone, it's called Bachmann's bundle of conduction cardiomyocytes. Now, as I say, there is still some controversy as to whether the atrial conduction systems really exist, but generally most people believe that these conduction pathways for conducting the electrical signal from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node and from the sinoatrial node to the left atrium do actually exist. Okay, so as I say, these are just specialized cardiomyocytes which can conduct the electrical signal faster than the normal standard contractile cardiomyocytes. Okay, but then they'll just, at the end of these conduction pathways, they'll just release it onto the cardiomyocytes, for instance in the case of Bachmann's bundle, or onto the atrioventricular node cardiomyocytes in the case of these internodal pathways. Okay, right. So now, the AV node cardiomyocytes, they are most definitely special conduction cardiomyocytes. So I'll just write this down. I said all of this, but then never actually got around to writing it down. So we talked about how there are these two major different types of cardiomyocytes: contractile cardiomyocytes, and then those that are specialized for conduction. Okay, and what we're really talking about here now is the conduction system throughout the heart, these special conduction pathways for conducting the electrical signal. But remember that the contractile cardiomyocytes, those that are specialized for contraction, which do contract, they can conduct the electrical signal as well and pass it on to their neighbours. Okay, so to review overall what's happening here, the sinoatrial node, this special block of conduction cardiomyocytes, these are very, very special because they generate electrical signals every 0.8 seconds or thereabouts, and we will see the mechanism later on when we study the nature of the electrical signal in more detail. Okay, they then chuck it out to all of the contractile cardiomyocytes surrounding them, and it propagates down the two atria. Okay, and it can just propagate like that. That's a perfectly viable theory because the contractile cardiomyocytes can conduct the electrical signal to their neighbours. However, we do believe there are these special conduction pathways within the atria. Firstly, this one that takes the electrical signal to the left atrium here, Bachmann's bundle, okay, and then these internodal conduction pathways, which we believe there are 3 of, which pass the signal to the atrioventricular node, which remember is this cluster of conduction cardiomyocytes that is the one window in the atrioventricular septum, and which is then going to pass the electrical signal onto the ventricular cardiomyocytes. Okay, right. Now, the atrioventricular node cardiomyocytes, these are more than just a funnel for taking the electrical signal through the atrioventricular septum here. They actually have this pacemaker activity as well, and there's a new key phrase that I didn't use previously. So we talked about how the sinoatrial node cells, they generate electrical signals at this rate of every 0.8 seconds. They generate 1. Okay, this property is known as the pacemaker property, or you can also call it the automaticity property, the fact that they can generate these electrical signals on their own. Okay, so the sinoatrial node cells, we say they have pacemaker activity. The atrioventricular node cells, these are very similar to the sinoatrial node cells. They actually have pacemaker activity as well. They are capable of generating electrical signals spontaneously at a certain rate. The thing is that the rate that they generate it is is considerably slower than the rate at which the sinoatrial node cells generate it. So they would generate an electrical signal every more time than this. Okay, so the rate they generate it, the number they generate in a minute, would be smaller than the number the sinoatrial node cells would generate in a minute. So the fact that these are pacemaker cells, that they can generate pacemaker activity, is actually irrelevant under normal cardiac physiology, because they're receiving the electrical signal all the time from that the sinoatrial node cells have generated. So you don't usually see the pacemaker activity of the atrioventricular node. It doesn't usually perform any function. However, if something goes wrong with the sinoatrial node, it means that the atrioventricular node can take over. It can now generate electrical activity spontaneously. Yes, it'll be at a lower rate than the sinoatrial node would be, and yes, it won't really help the atria that much, but it will then cause the ventricles to contract, and ventricles are the important bits. Okay, if you stop the atria contracting, that doesn't cause too much of a problem, as long as the ventricles are still contracting. I hope I've stressed that enough so far, that the ventricles are the main chambers of the heart. Okay, so this concept that the pacemaker activity of the AV node isn't normally seen, that has a special name. It's known as overdrive suppression. So the pacemaker activity of the AV node, we say, has been suppressed by the fact that we are being overdriven. The signal production is being overdriven by the sinoatrial node. So because the sinoatrial node is driving a pacemaker far faster than the AV node is driving a pacemaker, you don't see the AV node's pacemaker activity because it's just dwarfed. It's not apparent because the sinoatrial node sets the rate at which the heart beats. Okay, so in normal cardiac physiology then, all the atrioventricular node does is it's this link which carries the electrical signal generated by the sinoatrial node across the atrioventricular septum. However, a very important function of the atrioventricular node is that it's slow. It conducts action potentials it conducts electrical signals very slowly. Okay, and therefore it creates a delay, and that delay is important because we want there to be a delay between atrial contraction and ventricular contraction, because we want time for the blood from the atria to be forced into the ventricles, okay, before we then contract the ventricles. Okay, it would make no sense at all to have the ventricles and the atria contracting at the same time, because then blood wouldn't actually move from the atria into the ventricles because the ventricular pressure would be too high. Okay, so the atrioventricular node creates this delay then. Now, The question now becomes, does the atrioventricular node just release the electrical signal onto the ventricular myocytes? Okay, well the answer is no, and let me explain the reason it can't. The reason it can't just release it here is that if you did, how would the signal propagate? Well, it would propagate down here, down here, down here, and then eventually it would get down to this bottom portion here, okay? i.e., which cardiomyocytes would get the signal first? All of the ones up here at the top, and which ones would get it last? The ones at the bottom. So the ones at the top would contract first, and the ones at the bottom would contract last. What would happen if you did that? Okay, let me go back up to my anatomical picture. So the top of the ventricle would contract first, and then it would force blood where? Into the bottom of the ventricles, and then the bottom of the ventricles would then contract, and of course you'd then burst. Okay, so you do not want the top of the ventricles to contract first, and then the bottom of the ventricles to contract last. What you would prefer is it to be this chain of the bottom of the ventricles contract first, forcing the blood up into the top of the ventricles, and then the top of the ventricles contract, forcing the blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to shield this electrical signal. You do not just want to release it onto the ventricular cardiomyocytes right next to the AV node. You want to shield it from them. You want to insulate it, okay, with fibrous tissue again. You want to take the signal down to the bottom. You need some conduction system to take it down to the bottom of the heart, and then you can release it. And indeed, this conduction system does exist. So what's going to happen is the AV node is going to give it to another bunch of special cardiomyocytes that are specialized for conduction, and which will form a nice tract here. And initially it's just one tract running in the interventricular septum. And this one tract that is the continuation of the AV node here, and we're running out of space, so I'll go up here, is called the bundle of His. Okay, so a bundle of conductive cardiomyocytes that are conducting the electrical signal from the AV node down the ventricular septum. Okay, now, very quickly, the bundle of His is going to split into two separate branches, okay? One for the right side of the heart and one for the left side of the heart, okay, like so. And these are called the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch. So we'll have I'll just write one of them out, the right bundle branch, and of course also the left bundle branch. So the two branches of the bundle of His. So this of course will be the right bundle branch, and this one then will be the left bundle branch. Now it's important stressing again that all of these conduction pathways, they will be insulated with fibrous connective tissue to stop the electrical signal from spreading to the contractile cardiomyocytes. Okay, now what will happen is the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch will go round like so. Okay, and now they will split into smaller fibres which will deliver the electrical signal to the cardiomyocytes nearby, and these smaller fibres are going to be called Purkinje fibres. Okay, so this ventricular conduction system, so this is all part of the ventricular conduction system. Again, because space is limited, I won't write that out, but of course you can hopefully appreciate how ventricular conduction system would be written. Okay, so off these bundle branches then, here's the right bundle branch, we're going to have little Purkinje fibres coming off, and then off the left bundle branch here we're also going to have little Purkinje fibres, and they'll deliver the electrical signal to the local cardiomyocytes. And then of course it will spread from the contractile cardiomyocyte to the contractile cardiomyocyte. Okay, so there's the ventricular conduction system, and it ensures that the electrical signal starts at the base here. Okay, right. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you that these conduction cells, conduction cardiomyocytes in the ventricular conduction system, so the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibres, all of those have pacemaker activity as well. They can all generate electrical signals at a certain rhythmic rate as well, but their rhythmic rate is even smaller than that of the AV node, so we're gradually going down basically. The sinoatrial node drives the heart because it has the highest rate of generating electrical signals. Then the AV node is second to the sinoatrial node. It generates spontaneous electrical activity at a lower rate than the sinoatrial nodes. We don't usually see that because the sinoatrial node is quicker and therefore dominates it. And now even lower then you have the Purkinje fibres, which are also capable of generating spontaneous electrical activity, but it's at an even lower rate than either the sinoatrial node and the AV node. So only if something had happened to both the sinoatrial node and the AV node would the ventricular conduction system cells, so the cells of the bundle of His, the bundle branches and the Purkinje fibres, would those actually be driving the ventricular contraction. Okay, right. The next thing to say is also which portions of the ventricle contract when. Okay, so the electrical signal is propagating down the bundle branches, and you might think that the first bit of the ventricle that's going to contract is these portions down here, but actually there's a bit that I want you to be aware of that contracts first, and this is really important when we come on to interpreting electrocardiograms, which is going to be a follow-on video from this video on the cardiac cycle and cardiac electrophysiology. What happens firstly is actually the interventricular septum receives the signal. So what actually happens is at the base of the left bundle branch here, there are fibres that are releasing the signal from the left bundle branch onto the interventricular septum here. So what's actually going to happen is the interventricular septum cardiomyocytes, the signal is going to go up like this. It's going to propagate up the interventricular septum, and they're all going to start receiving the electrical signal and contracting. So that's what's actually going to happen first, and it's important to be aware of that for understanding of the electrocardiogram. And then what's going to happen is we'll follow the bundle branches round here. Oh, and by the way, it's the left bundle branch that delivers the signal to the interventricular cardiomyocytes. Okay, so signals from the left bundle branch go to the cardiomyocytes of the interventricular septum and will propagate between those cardiomyocytes of the interventricular septum, causing contraction of the interventricular septum. Then what will happen is the signal will arrive down here and down here, okay, and the Purkinje fibres will deliver it to the cardiomyocytes. Now you can see the way I've drawn this. These bundle branches and the Purkinje fibres, they're all in the very inner portion of the myocardium. Okay, now that portion of the myocardium is known as the Sub Endocardial Myocardium. Okay, so I'll put that, that's a key word. So Sub Endocardial Myocardium. So the endocardium is the endothelial cells that cover the heart. So just like the entire circulatory system has endothelial cells over it, the heart, the walls of the heart have endothelial cells over them. Okay, and those endothelial cells are known as the endocardium. So the portion of the myocardium, the muscle of the heart, that is underneath the endocardium, that's known as the subendocardial myocardium. Okay, it's the inner portion of the myocardium, but this is a fancier word. Okay, so the inner myocardium then, in the walls of the ventricles, is going to receive the electrical signal first, and it's therefore going to propagate outwards like so. And the reason I am stressing this is because it's so important for understanding the QRS complex in an ECG, which we will come on to in the next, well, not in this video, but in a follow-up video to this. Okay, so the electrical signal will then propagate from the inner portions of the myocardium out to the outer portions of the myocardium. And the outer portions of the myocardium, there is again a fancy word for that. It's called the subepicardial myocardium. Okay, so underneath the epicardium this time, which is a layer on the outside of the heart rather than on the inside of the heart. Okay, so the outer portions of myocardium are known as the subepicardial myocardium. So the electrical signal is going to propagate from the subendocardial, the inner myocardium, to the subepicardial, the outer myocardium, like so. Okay, so that's the second thing that's going to happen. And then finally what's going to happen is you can see that these bundle branches, the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch, they don't get right up to these portions of the ventricle here. Okay, so what then is going to happen is the Purkinje fibres will finally release it right over here, and then the signal will propagate up these posterior portions of the ventricular wall. And again, the reason I'm stressing this is because it's really important for understanding the QRS complex of an ECG. Okay, so that's the order that the signal will arrive in all the portions of the ventricular wall. Firstly, the left bundle branch will give it to the interventricular septum, and it will propagate up the interventricular septum in this direction. Then the bundle branches will release it to the main body, the main bulk of the myocardium here. And an important point to understand is it's released in the Sub Endocardial Myocardium, and it will propagate outwards to the Sub Epicardial Myocardium. And then finally, it'll be released up to these very posterior portions, the right back of the ventricles, and it'll propagate upwards in that direction there. Okay, so that's the way then that the electrical signal is going to propagate through the heart. And of course, when the electrical signal arrives at the cardiomyocyte, it will cause that cardiomyocyte to contract. So all of this will be resulting in ventricular contraction. Okay, right, so I think that's all I want to say in this video. In the next video, what we will do is we'll do this rigorously. So we will talk about the actual nature of this electrical signal. We will start using the term action potential rather than electrical signal, and we'll put everything together. So we'll talk about the way that the sinoatrial node cells actually do generate spontaneous action potentials every 0.8 seconds. We'll talk about the way that you get action potentials in normal contractile cardiomyocytes, and the way that that propagates by saltatory conduction, and how then it propagates from cardiomyocyte to cardiomyocyte. And I will stress again that in the ventricles, again, ventricular cardiomyocytes, normal contractile ones, can pass the signal from themselves to their neighbours. So it does, the conduction system, it's very important, but the contractile cardiomyocytes don't go away thinking that they just contract, they don't conduct the electrical signal. They do conduct the electrical signal. The conduction system are just these cells that are specialised for conduction, and the purpose of those is to make the propagation of the electrical signal through the heart more complex in this way that is desirable. As I've explained, you don't want to just release the electrical signal at the top of the ventricles. That wouldn't be a good idea. So you need a specialised conduction system that's insulated from the rest of the heart to take it down to the base of the ventricles, where it's then released. Okay, so we'll go over the actual nature of the electrical signal in the next video.